Hello, everyone. I'm Bonnie Low-Kramen. I'm your host for Heads Together. It is Wednesday, June 9th, 2021, and I am here with my able assistant. Hi, Jennifer Wilner.
Hi, Bon.
Really happy to be here today and very excited for today's topic, which is to talk about the debate and the subject of salary versus hourly pay compensation and exempt and non-exempt, and to kind of make sense of this. We have a fabulous expert guest speaker with us today. And so before we introduce Amber Clayton, I want to welcome our viewers and listeners from all over the world who are joining us. Hi, Denise from Boston. Great to have you with us. Today's topic is hourly and salary compensation. Jen and I were talking about how most everybody in the workplace knows what it feels like to be paid hourly. I was remembering back that after babysitting for $2 an hour when I was young, I got a job in a clothing store and in a bakery. In both those situations, I was paid hourly and had to punch a clock, a literal clock, which I didn't like at all. Like, there was always this pressure about the time clock. And even when I was a teenager, I remember at the time thinking, someday I don't want to punch a clock anymore. Huh. And Jen, how about you? And welcome to all of our viewers from all over. Anne and Anna and Allison and Lori. Oh my gosh, we've got to move right along here. This is so exciting. Jen,
I remember I was working at John Frank's in the ladies department in Westfield, New Jersey, and I loved my job, and I was punching a time clock, but I remember I was excited about it. There was a little bit of angst about being on time. So I always punched in at least 2 minutes early because you had to start your job on time. Didn't matter what time you punched in.
There were rules about this. There were rules. And so, hello, welcome to everyone joining us on the show today. I'm certain that most everybody can remember back to that hourly job you had, and maybe you had a clock to punch, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you had a timesheet to fill out. But what's interesting is that, so then we all grow up, right? And we get into the workplace, and there's this nagging thing in our heads that think about the idea that, wow, if we get to be salaried, then somehow we've made it. Somehow it's different than being paid hourly. And then there I go working, for Olympia Dukakis for 25 years and then teaching and speaking. And what I'm aware of is that those thoughts about hourly versus salary have carried with us, not only me in the workplace, but the assistants I teach and speak to all over the United States. And now today's subject is specific to the United States. And let me just say that I'm so fortunate to have connected with an expert on this subject. Mary Chetty from SHRM is a listener today on the call. Hi, Mary. It's great to have you here. And she connected us with Amber Clayton, also from SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management. And that's what we do at Heads Together, is we bring together the experts to talk about this stuff. And when we were on a call, Mary, Amber, and I realized I had my facts wrong. And even Amber, who's an expert on hourly versus salary, even she said during our call together that these rules are a big secret, that there's not a lot that's straightforward about it. But nonetheless, I want very much to have us understand a whole lot more, because when I would ask assistants, do you understand the difference and why that decision is being made? The majority of assistants say, no, I have no idea why I'm being paid hourly versus salary. Okay. Claudia's saying she lived in Westwood. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker today. Her name is Amber Clayton. She's been working in HR for over 20 years. She's based in Alexandria, Virginia, and she oversees at SHRM the Knowledge Center. And you know what they do? They're kind of like the answer desk. And in 2020, they fielded over 66,000 questions. That's 66,000 questions from SHRM members over 2020. And that was an increase, of course, over the previous year. Amber is the one they call to do media interviews. So this is something Amber does all the time. She knows her way around a camera, that's for sure. And she co-hosts a podcast. It's called Honest HR, where she uncovers and explores uncomfortable, complicated, and sometimes wonderful truths about the workplace. Well, we want her to do that for us today. She's got some great links for us and fantastic information. I couldn't wait for June 9th. Let us please welcome Amber Clayton from SHRM.
Hi, thank you, Bonnie and Jen.
Hi, Amber. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Amber, I think Jen is going to just welcome to this show. And I wonder, were you surprised when we got on the call with Mary and about the kind of questions I was asking you about executive assistants?
I actually wasn't. In the Knowledge Center, we answer tens of thousands of questions every year. And our top two topics are typically the Family and Medical Leave Act. And then other questions, the top two are compensation related questions, the Fair Labor Standards Act. So it wasn't surprising to hear some of the questions that were coming about, because these are questions that a lot of people have, a lot of employers have, and a lot of employees have. And, you know, this stuff is complicated. You mentioned that it's a secret, and not necessarily a secret per se, like we don't want people to know. I mean, the information is out there, but a lot of people aren't aware of it. They don't know where to look or where to go to find the information related to the Fair Labor Standards Act and compensation. And they may not even realize that there are laws around these things. It's not just at the employer's discretion. So even for myself, I've been in HR, as you said, for over 20 years. And it could be complicated. And sometimes I have to look back and you know, I'm constantly learning myself, just because the workplace is evolving. Laws change, whether it's federal or state laws or local laws. And so we're constantly making sure that we're updating ourselves so that we can help our members who are primarily HR professionals, but many of them not. Many of them are individuals, maybe some this call today, who have some HR responsibilities as executive assistants and working in this administrative field. And so, you know, we want to make sure that we help people and we guide them to the information so that they can either determine their course of action or answer those challenging questions that they have and take information back to their workplace.
Right. And that's the goal for today. I know we're going to get to your slides, but the goal is, because I asked you to be specific about executive assistants regarding these rules. And what the hope is that the information that Amber's going to share will arm you with a lot of data, you know, current data that you can then, everyone on this call could go back to their HR professionals and have the conversation in a more knowledgeable way. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. We definitely want to make sure that, you know, people are informed, whether you're the employer or the employee, and that that there's at least a broad understanding. I'm not going to be able to go through every detail of the Fair Labor Standards Act today, but as you said, we're going to be talking about the administrative portion of it. And, you know, hopefully some questions that you may have will be answered with this.
Perfect. And so I want to invite everyone listening to enter your questions in the chat box, and Amber's going to speak for a bit, and then we will get to as many as we possibly can. You will have a way to reach Amber afterwards, and she's going to be providing links. I urge everybody on this call to take notes, because I was filled with pages of notes after we spoke the first time, and there's a lot to know, but I am much clearer on it now, I'll tell you that. So with that, Amber, take it away.
Great, great. So if we can go ahead and bring up the slides, I want to be able to share some information with everyone. If we can go to slide number 3, and, I mentioned the Fair Labor Standards Act, and, some individuals may not know what that is or may not have heard of it before. I'm going to refer to it as the FLSA. But what the FLSA is, it's a federal law. It establishes the minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, the youth employment standards that are affecting employees in the private sector and in the federal, state, and local governments. So, with that, and I think, Jen, if you go ahead and click those, the information is going to come up perfect. All right. So minimum wage, for anyone who may not realize this, the federal minimum wage is actually $7.25 per hour. And Bonnie and Jim, where you were talking about your jobs and your past work history, I was thinking to myself, I was paid $4, I think at 25 cents an hour to work at a women's clothing store. So I was very similar, but I also worked for this pet store called Wings, Wags, and Whiskers. So it's, I've had, many positions over a lifetime. And I remember those days of being paid hourly. And as you said, punching the clock and, using the biometrics that some companies have now. But with that, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. Some states actually have their own minimum wages. And in those cases, employers need to pay the wage that's the most beneficial for the employee. So while it's $7.25 under federal law, some of you who may get paid minimum wage now, hopefully more than minimum wage, may be getting more than that because of your state or local laws. Mm-hmm. The other thing is overtime. So overtime, what this means is that covered non-exempt employees, and I'm going to talk about non-exempt employees here shortly, they must receive overtime when they work over 40 hours in a work week. And that's really important. That's under federal law. And they get paid, that overtime rate is 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. So if you're a person that makes $10 an hour, that overtime rate would be $15 an hour. Non-exempt, again, we're going to talk about that, but just keep in mind that under federal law, there are overtime pay rules, and then there are rules under state and local laws regarding overtime as well. With respect to the hours of work for employees, the hours of work ordinarily, it includes all time during which an employee actually is required to be on the employer's premises, on duty, now, of course, at home, because we know many people are still working from home, or maybe a hybrid of working at home and working at the site. And again, the prescribed workplace, that is any hours that include all-time work. Keep that in mind that when you take a vacation and sick time, I know this is very confusing for some people, that when you're off, that's not considered hours worked. So that would not apply towards overtime. So just, keep that in mind, that vacation, sick time, personal day leave, you're not actually working on those days, but for many of you, you're getting paid for that time not worked. Hours worked is basically just that, worked, anything hours worked. And then, of course, record keeping is one of the things I mentioned. Employers must do things like they must post an official poster, including the requirements under the FLSA. They must keep the employee time and pay records. And one of the things that you mentioned, Bonnie, is about punching a time clock. And interestingly, for both exempt and non-exempt, which again, I'm going to explain, they can actually both punch a time clock. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just someone who's non-exempt punching a time clock. Anybody can be required to punch a time clock or write a time card or a time sheet. So I will get into that when we go into a little bit more detail. And then, of course, those child labor provisions that I mentioned. And we're not going to cover the record keeping and child labor provisions today, but I'm going to talk more on the side of the minimum wage, overtime, the record keeping portion of it. So if we can go to slide 4. And if you want to go ahead, there's some animated there. Perfect. All right. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of this. Oftentimes, these terms are used interchangeably, but they're actually very different. Exempt means that the person is exempt from receiving overtime under the federal and state and local laws. Non-exempt means they are eligible for overtime for all hours worked beyond 40 in a work week, or if it's a state and local law that has a more beneficial overtime, like California, for example, has an overtime rate for over 8 hours in a day and 40 hours in a week. And if they have 12 hours in a day, it's a double time. So there's differences there from state and local laws. But under federal law, anything worked beyond 40 in a work week is considered paid at overtime, and a non-exempt employee is eligible for overtime. Salaried means that the person is just receiving the same amount of pay week over week, regardless of how many hours a week that are worked. And then if you're hourly, that just means that you get paid an hourly wage for all time work. So it's 4 different terms. They mean something different. And I say that because oftentimes they do get confused. So again, exempt, no overtime eligibility. Non-exempt, you are eligible for overtime. Salary just means you're getting paid a set salary. And hourly means that you're getting an hourly wage for all hours worked. So if we can go to slide 4 or 5. So the question is, who decides whether or not you're exempt, non-exempt, salaried, hourly? Well, your employer decides that. And, with that, the question is, okay, why would employers want to make employees exempt, for example, where they're not eligible for overtime? Well, the main reason for that is that they could avoid the cost of overtime paid to you. So overtime can get really costly depending on the position and how much somebody's paid. So an employer sometimes will look at the position and determine whether or not it can be classified as exempt under federal or state or local laws. And the secondary reason might be record keeping. So even though an employer can require an employee to punch a clock or put time down on a timesheet or time card, they don't have to necessarily for exempt employees, because exempt employees are not eligible for overtime. So the law doesn't require an employer to actually keep track of their hours from the time they come in to the time they leave, because they're just getting a set salary regardless of the number of hours a week that they're working. And Bonnie, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit too. Despite what people may think, being exempt and paid a salary doesn't necessarily mean that you're at a higher level than someone who is non-exempt and paid an hourly wage. Mm-hmm. Most exempt employees, they typically have higher level responsibilities, but the employees, there are non-exempt employees who still have higher level responsibilities, and they're still classified as non-exempt and paid hourly. A chief executive officer, a CEO of a company, believe it or not, can be classified as a non-exempt hourly position. The employer is the one who decides whether or not somebody can be classified as exempt. And that's based on how they're paid, what they're paid, and what their responsibilities are.
Right. And I'm going to interrupt 1 second just to interject to say that I was sharing incorrect information. I was under an impression that companies decided to make someone hourly in order to save money. And what you made me clear on is that that is not necessarily the case at all. And in fact, it may cost companies much more money to pay people hourly with overtime. But that, Amber, is only if overtime is permitted to be taken. And on our call, we talked about how many assistants find themselves in a situation where they're putting in more than 40 hours a week, but the culture of the company says, oh, you might have to work more than 40, but don't take the overtime. It's again, somehow there will be some backlash or repercussions. Is that something you could address now, or you want to hold that?
No, absolutely. And again, this is not something that's unheard of. Even for my own mother who works in the medical field and she's been paid on an hourly basis, I can recall her company saying, don't work overtime, but if you do, you can't put it on the time card. That's unlawful. If you are working overtime and you're paid non-exempt, you're a non-exempt employee eligible for overtime, and you're paid an hourly wage or salary, which I'll talk about that in a minute because non-exempt employees can be paid salary too. If you're not getting the overtime and you're working, then the employer could be held responsible for that. And they could be have to provide back wages for overtime pay that wasn't paid. So as an employee, you want to be sure to make sure that you're tracking your time according to your company's policies. But if you have someone who's saying you can't get paid for the overtime that you worked, that could be problematic. And so you want to make sure that you talk to your manager, talk to HR about that. What could happen is the employer could have a policy that says, hey, we don't want employees to work overtime, and that's fine. If an employee does work overtime, the company is benefiting from that, and they should be paid for that time. What could happen, though, is that employee could face disciplinary action if they're violating that company's policy of working overtime when they're not supposed to. So they still get paid for it, but they could face disciplinary action if they continue to work overtime when the company says no overtime is permitted. So that's kind of what happens in those particular situations. But if there's someone telling you you can't get paid for work that you're performing, then that could be a problem. And you may want to contact your state's Department of Labor if your HR and your management is not complying with the law. If that makes sense.
Sure does. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the non-exempt employee. As a non-exempt employee, you must make at least a minimum wage. And again, you're eligible for overtime. With a non-exempt employee, typically they're paid on an hourly basis, but they can be paid other ways. They can be paid a piece rate, for example. So if you're making a product, you can get paid for each piece of a product that you make. They can get paid a day rate. So if, for example, you have someone who's working at someone's home, maybe working with the elderly or someone with a medical condition, they could get paid a daily rate of, let's say, $50, as long as the number of hours that they work, when you divide that, it does equal or is more than minimum wage. And yes, non-exempt employees can be paid as salaried. And I'm sure that there are some people that are on the call currently that may have this situation where they're paid as salary, but they're also eligible for overtime. And that could get a little complicated, and I could talk about that a little bit later, but I just want to, at least put it out there that with a non-exempt employee, common for it to be an hourly wage, but you can get paid a piece rate, a day rate, you can get paid a salary, and you can get paid a commission as long as you're receiving at least minimum wage and you're receiving overtime for any hours worked beyond 40 in a work week or whatever the standard is for your state or local area.
And have you heard of that with executive assistants, Amber?
Absolutely. Yes. We've had executive assistants. I've heard of executive assistants who get paid on a salary, and they're also considered non-exempt. And since we're on the topic, I guess I can go ahead and talk about it. With that, and I don't want to try to confuse things, but when someone is non-exempt and they're paid a salary, there's a couple of ways that an employer can set up the pay program. They can have a salary for a set schedule during the work week, so a fixed work week schedule. So I'm Amber, I'm an executive assistant. I work 40 hours a week and I get a certain salary. But if I go beyond 40 hours in a work week, I get my salary plus I get an overtime rate for any hours over 40 hours a week. So that's one way. The second way is for a fluctuating work week. So again, Amber, executive assistant, I get paid a salary for the work week, but each week I work different hours. So this week I work 30 hours, next week I work 50 hours. I'm getting paid that salary regardless of the hours that I'm working per week. I am still owed, though, for overtime. But in this case, I'm going to get a half of the rate. So, and this is where it gets a little complicated, which is why I don't like to always bring this one up. But of course, our attendees are probably going to have this situation. But they're getting that set salary for the 30 hours, the set salary for the 50 hours, and anything above 40 hours in a work week, they'll get a half time. So they would get, instead of $10 an hour, they would get, $5 an hour extra for that overtime that's worked. So it's a little complicated with that particular scenario, but I just wanted to make sure I brought it up because I know there's going to be attendees that have that particular situation.
And that's all about keeping really accurate records, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There should be accurate record keeping for non-exempt employees, regardless of how they're paid.
Gotcha.
Yes. And that's, what employers are required to do under federal law and under the state and local laws. So that is non-exempt. Now, to be exempt, there's a few criteria that needs to be met. The employee must earn a minimum amount. And under federal law, that's $684 a week, or the equivalent of $35,568 a year. And that is the minimum amount under federal law that someone would need to make in order to be classified as exempt. In addition to that, they must be paid on a salary or a fee basis. So it's in these particular cases, to be exempt, they would need to get paid that $684 a week. They couldn't be paid on a piece rate or a day rate or an hourly rate. I will say, and again, there are some exceptions to that, but today I'm just going to talk about the salary fee basis. And then they have to be able to perform, or they must be performing specific job duties. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later. So any questions before I move on to the next one? I know this can get really complicated. I'm trying to keep it as broad overview.
Let me just alert everybody to those words, job duties. Those of you on this call have heard me for many, many months talking about the value of a detailed job description. Well, when I had my call with Amber, the conversation made me clearer, 10 times clearer about that need. So I'm alerting you all to that right this minute about the incredibly important need for a detailed job description, because that is those are key pieces of information that will help distinguish whether you're exempt or non-exempt, which Amber, you're going to explain. But let me just say that one out loud, that if you don't have one already, that detailed job description, today is the day to put your time and energy into that.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to go back on something that I said earlier that was on the presentation, but I didn't call out. There's no requirement to ever make a position exempt. An employer can have all of their employees within the organization as non-exempt hourly or non-exempt piece rate. Anyone can be non-exempt. It's when the employer decides to make an employee exempt that they're required to meet certain criteria. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I know Mary, who's on the call now, she told us during that meeting that we had, Bonnie, that she knew of a company where everyone in the company was non-exempt and paid an hourly rate.
Including the CEO.
Including the CEO, and that is not unheard of. So again, kind of think of it as everyone's presumed to be non-exempt until an employer decides that they want to make the person exempt. Okay. And as I mentioned, they're doing that because they might want to avoid overtime, or because they may not want to do the record keeping. It's just easier administratively for them. So
what assistants are sitting there, many of them are thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm the only person at my company that is being paid hourly. And so we talked about that on the call. So I know we'll get into that some. The them and us dynamic, which is not helpful in the workplace.
No, absolutely. And, honestly, I'm an exempt salaried employee now. And sometimes when I talk to my mother, I think to myself, gosh, I wish I was hourly non-exempt, because I could be making so much in overtime right now. I mean, it's not a negative thing. And, as I mentioned, anyone is non-exempt hourly unless an employer decides to make them salaried non-exempt. It really doesn't mean that someone's at a lower level, a lower position, or that they're seen at a lower level. That's more of a workplace culture issue.
Yes, well, that is exactly it. And lack of education, lack of transparency around these issues. So please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about the categories of exemptions, even though we're only going to go over one today, which is more related to the people who are attending today. But the categories of exemptions include executive, administrative, professional, computer-related, outside sales, and highly compensated employees. So these are all the categories where an employer could go in and say, does my employee meet the criteria of any of these exemptions? And so, again, being exempt means that you're not entitled to overtime because you're in one of these categories and you meet that specific criteria. So again, we're just going to talk about the administrative one, which is probably most applicable to the audience today.
Right.
So with the administrative exemption, you have to be paid at least the established minimum salary, which we said before was $684, I think, $684. And the secondary part of that is that you primarily perform office or non-manual work that's directly related to the management or the general business operations of the company. Those two bullets are pretty easy to establish when you're in this type of a role. Where it gets a little tricky is the third bullet, where you engage in work requiring the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. This is where most employees and employers get stumped, is that discretion, independent judgment, and matters of significance. So the first one, I just want to, I'm going to break it down here on the next slide. The first criteria, as I mentioned, pretty clear. You have to make at least $684 under federal law a week. But again, there could be something, higher under state or local law. And for those of you who are not in the U.S., there may be laws in your country where you have minimum requirements, and that you have something similar to the U.S. where the categories of exempt versus non-exempt and overtime or hourly and salary. So today, we're primarily talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is U.S. based, but there may be laws in your specific countries that are very similar to these, and hopefully these slides and the terminology that I'm using could probably help you find or locate, or if you wanted to contact me, I can try to point you in the right direction for that information.
Thank you.
No problem. And so for the next one, the second bullet, primarily performs office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations. So what does primarily mean? It basically means that it's the principal, the main major, the most important duty that you perform. It's not just a one-time project or task, it's actually ongoing. So the Department of Labor, they're going to look at the whole job when conducting their audits to determine if someone is classified appropriately. So, when you think about that, is it something that you do on a regular basis? The other thing is directly related. So that just means that, it must be work performed directly related to assisting the running of the business, the servicing of the business. It could be, different areas. It could be tax and finance and accounting, budgeting, insurance, health and personnel management, HR, insurance, quality control. There's a number of different ways that it could be directly related to the operations of the business, computer networking, public relations, etc. Now, that third tricky bullet. So, what does the exercise of discretion and independent judgment mean? And Jen, I'm sorry, if you want to flip through to the 12th slide, I think. Yeah, there you go. I just kind of highlighted some of these so I know where I am in this session. So in general, the exercise of discretion and independent judgment, it involves comparing and evaluating the possible courses of conduct and acting or making a decision after those variabilities have been considered. Now, I know that's a kind of a mouthful, but when I think that many people know when you have that ability to exercise discretion and judgment, that you can make a decision where you don't necessarily have to get approval. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have to get approval that you're not going to make that exemption classification. But there are things like, for example, where you might have responsibility or judgment when it comes to hiring someone or firing someone. Some of those decisions that, your boss, your managers, allow you to be able to exercise that discretion and judgment instead of them to do it, or maybe they have input in it, but you're responsible for it. So those could be things that you're exercising discretion and judgment. Now, with regards to matters of significance, and actually, you know what, if we can go to the next slide, Jen, I did put a few things on here for you so that you understood about the discretion and independent judgment part. So, I'll let you all read this, but basically carrying out those major assignments that we talked about, that it affects the business operations to a substantial degree, that you have the authority to waive or deviate from the established policies and practices. Those are just some things that are samples of that exercise of discretion and independent judgment.
Right. And Amber, may I just remind myself, really, was there a percentage of the work that had to be in this category, or am I not remembering that right?
No, there has been a kind of I don't want to say unknown or known, but I've heard people say, 50% of the responsibilities need to be in this area. And again, the Department of Labor is going to look at the job as a whole. So it may not be 50%. And really it's, looking at all the responsibilities of this individual, how they're paid, what they're paid, to make that determination as to what, whether or not they could be classified as.
Right. So everyone on this call will see why I said what I did about the job description. If you have an obsolete or overly generic or just out of date job description, I know a lot of you on this call, and I know that you fit this description, and probably 50% of your job you get to make budgetary decisions. A lot of assistants get you've got $2,000 to make a decision, and you don't have to ask anybody if you do that kind of thing. So that's putting the pressure on the job description, because when people are making these decisions, it's the legal department looking at your job description, and it's also HR looking at your job description. And that was, for me, Amber, you gave me my aha moment when it came to this. Please take your screenshot of this slide, folks, and Amber's going to give you more links to this, but this is it to me. I don't know, I'm not overstating it, am I?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is something that you'll want to know so that you can understand how you're paid, why you're paid this, and take this back if you have questions to your HR department, to your payroll person, to your compensation specialist if you have one, or your manager. This is good information for you to know so that you can understand why you're paid the way you're paid. And hopefully many of you are working in organizations that have a transparent compensation philosophy, that they're sharing with you how they structure their pay, sharing with you pay ranges. Those types of things should be transparent in an organization. Not to say that they have to be under law, but I know many employers are making it transparent so that people can see, what they're paid, how they're paid, what type of movement they can have within their organization. If they want to be promoted, does it make sense to go from your position to another position that may be paid the same rate? So hopefully there's some type of a compensation philosophy or policy or practice within your organization that you could refer back to.
Right. And I've had students take this information back to their HR professionals and schedule a meeting to have this conversation. And it has in all three cases, it has reaped positive results, because Amber, it should be transparent, but I'm here to tell you that in real life, it's not.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not surprised by that, especially when you work in the business that I'm in and we hear all the questions that we're getting from employers about their policies and practices or lack thereof. It doesn't surprise me. But, everyone needs to arm themselves with the information if they're going to be able to go out there and, ask the right questions and get, what they want and what they deserve and what they should, have. These are the things that you have to look at for yourself. Yep.
Agreed.
All right, great. So, with the next one, just about the matters of significance, and that just refers to the level of importance or consequence of the work performed, and this is going to vary significantly based on the position and the industry. An employee, for example, does not exercise discretion and judgment with matters of significance merely because they might experience a financial loss if the employee failed to perform, part of their job properly. Similarly, if they, operate expensive equipment and something of that nature, that doesn't necessarily mean that's an exercise of independent judgment and discretion for matters of significance. Unfortunately, the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, doesn't have a list of duties that meet that matters of significance, but they do provide duties and tasks that don't necessarily qualify. So you could, for example, entering accounts payable, accounts receivable, word processing or sending notices and reminders of contractual obligations, things like that, ordering routine supplies, answering phones and taking messages. Those types of things wouldn't typically be considered independent judgment and discretion on matters of significance. But like I said, if you have tasks such as hiring, firing, managing other people, creating company policies, working major projects, those types of things could be considered matters of significance. But it does, vary depending on the position and the industry. So something to keep in mind.
Yep.
All right. So I know we're coming up close to the end of my slide, but I just want to talk about some of the common mistakes because, as you mentioned, it's not always like that in the real world. There are mistakes that are made. So, for example, considering an employee who's paid a salary as an exempt employee, but they don't meet the job-related exemption criteria, that's a common mistake of employers. And sometimes in those situations when they're audited or when there's a complaint filed, they may have to pay back wages, overtime for someone who may have been misclassified. This happens very frequently where employers misclassify employees as exempt and pay a salary. So that's why it's really important for employers to be able to understand or at least, review these laws and sometimes to get legal counsel to review it as well to ensure that they're in compliance with the federal and state laws. Again, not paying that overtime, as I mentioned, where someone's saying, hey, you can work it, but don't put that overtime in there. That, again, is problematic for employees. Where you, as an employee, if you decide to work overtime and your employer says, no, you can't work overtime, that's a disciplinary issue. That isn't a compensation one. They should still be paying you because they're reaping the benefits of your work during that overtime period. And the other thing that tends to come up frequently are wage deductions and unlawful wage deductions, making, for example, automatic pay deductions for meal breaks without making sure that the employee has actually taken the break. So I am sure that there are many of you on this call today who have sat at your desk and ate your lunch and worked at the same time, but didn't get paid for it. These are the types of things, one, you should be taking your breaks because everybody needs some break time in between their work. Get up, walk around, go shopping, take a lunch. But when you work through those lunches, if you're getting that automatically deducted, that could be a problem. So you want to make sure that you do talk to your employer and HR about that. And like I said, this stuff can be complicated. It's confusing, and there's a lot of information out there. I have provided some resources that are on the next slide. These are from the Department of Labor. There's a lot more out there than what I'm listing here, but these are the ones that are specific to the administrative employees that I mentioned that could give you that information about independent judgment and discretion and matters of significance. All of these can help you. And there's even this nice little tool at the bottom. It's the third one. It's an overtime security advisor, and it asks you specific questions, and you kind of go through and answer them, and it can help determine whether or not you are you should be classified as exempt. But again, keep in mind, the employer doesn't have to make you exempt and salaried if they don't want to. They can have everybody non-exempt and paid an hourly wage.
So Jen, if you can put those links in the chat as well. And of course, everybody knows we're recording today. So this is going to live on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn. So there are all kinds of ways that you can get this information after this session is over. But this is so useful. Is that it for? No, you've got some contact info.
Yeah,
right?
I was just going to say the next slide, I do have some contact information. You're more than welcome to contact me directly if you have any questions. I will say that we at SHRM have numerous resources available for anyone. And our membership is $219 a year. It is well worth it for all the resources and the access to my service, the Ask an Advisor service to ask questions. So if you're interested, check out the SHRM.org and our member benefits or membership at the top. You can see, what's available, but we do have questions that are around this particular topic, especially the one that I mentioned about non-exempt employees and how they can be paid a salary based on a work week and a fluctuating work week, because there are regulations around it. It's not as clear, but we do have Q&As that are in layman's terms that make it a little bit easier to understand. And that is available on our website if you are a member.
Right. Very cool. And someone is asking if these slides can be shared. And I mean, Amber, you knew that these slides are going to be on the recording. Is it fine if people just share the recording?
Absolutely.
With these slides on them.
Okay. Absolutely.
So we're going to take some questions now. That's it for your slides, right, Amber?
Yes.
Okay. So Jen, if you can bring us back, and I know there are a bunch of questions on there that we'll see what we have time for. Jen, could you put some of them up? Yeah, people are saying it's lots to take in. Yes,
it is. It is. And I didn't even touch on everything under FLSA. This is just a fraction of it.
But FLSA was a revelation to me, the Fair Labor Standards Act. So Laura is saying, how is salaried different from exempt?
Yes. So if we go back to in the beginning of the presentation, I don't know if you are able to pull that back up. There is a slide that talks about exempt, non-exempt, salaried, and hourly. And as I mentioned, an exempt person is just someone who meets certain criteria. It's the fourth slide. They meet certain criteria in order to not be eligible for overtime. So they're not eligible for overtime. Being paid a salary just means that someone is paid the same amount week to week, regardless of the hours that they work. So, I could be paid $600 a week and work a 50-hour work week or a 40-hour work week, and I still get $600 a week. And that's if I'm paid salary and I'm also classified as exempt. Did that help?
But exempt, so both of them are not eligible for overtime?
Nope, just the exempt part of it. So the salary and hourly is just how the person is paid. So if they're paid a set salary, they get the same guaranteed amount week over week. And then there's an hourly wage that they get paid based on the hours of work that they work. The exempt and non-exempt part is, are they eligible for overtime or are they not eligible for overtime? Mm-hmm. And it's the exempt part that you have to meet that certain criteria of being paid on a salary basis, being paid at least the minimum salary under federal or state or local laws, and then meeting that job requirements of the position. So somebody, typically somebody who's paid a salary is classified as exempt, but that's not always the case. Okay. But normally it's an exempt person is paid a salary.
So Amber, thanks Jen for having that up there. For everybody on the call, what's the question to HR? If people want to do their homework and then go into HR and have a meeting, what's the question to them to understand how it's handled at their company?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the first things I would say is look at your offer letter if you had one, because usually in the employment offer letter, it will state how you're paid. It will state that you're either paid on an hourly basis, and it'll give the hourly wage and maybe the number of hours a week that you're scheduled to work or your schedule. Sometimes if you are paid a salary, it will even provide they'll provide an annual salary in there, or they may state it on a biweekly basis or however it's paid in the organization. And so I would look at that first, and then I'd also look at your job description, because sometimes the classifications are listed on the job description. It will say whether or not you're considered exempt or non-exempt. So that's another thing to look at. Look at your handbook. And also you can go to your HR or to your manager if you're unsure about how you're paid, and simply ask, am I considered an exempt or a non-exempt employee?
Right.
Am I paid a salary or an hourly? Sometimes you can even look at your paycheck stubs. You'll be able to see on there, do you have a set salary that you're making every week? Is your paycheck the same every week or every 2 weeks or however you're paid? Or are you getting paid based on the hours worked? In those particular situations, when you're paid on the hours worked, you can see on your paycheck stub, am I paid overtime? If I'm paid overtime, then it's likely that I'm a non-exempt employee. If I'm not paid any overtime, then I'm considered exempt.
So if you look at your job description or something official from the company and it says either exempt or non-exempt, take a hard look at that job description to make sure it's accurate, because that's the thing that I'm hearing overwhelmingly, is that the job description that people are doing, Amber, bear very little resemblance to the one that they were given. And the one that's official.
Absolutely. And employers should be regularly looking at the job descriptions and making modifications as needed, especially if a job or role changes. Let's say, especially with last year with COVID, many people were laid off and other people had to take on extra responsibilities.
Right.
Employers should be looking at those to see, should they be updating their job descriptions based on these new responsibilities, these new roles?
Right.
Is it temporary? Those are the types of things that they'll need to look at. But absolutely, everyone should be looking at their job descriptions to see whether or not they're actually doing what's on the job descriptions. And you'll probably notice too that there's that little line that sometimes says other duties as assigned. So keep in mind that you're not going to have every single responsibility on a job description, but the primary ones, your major job functions, should be listed on the job description.
Right. Absolutely. Jen, let's have a few more. So we've got about 8 minutes to go. Thank you, Amber, for being so generous with your time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exempt employees would just pay their regular overtime rate for any time worked, including anything over 40 hours.
So that would be non-exempt employees. Non-exempt employees would get paid non-exempt employees would get paid overtime for any time worked over 40 hours in a week under federal law. And then, of course, if there's any state or local laws. Exempt employees aren't eligible for overtime. So even if they worked, let's just say they had a normal work week of 40 hours a week as an exempt employee, and they happen to work 45 hours a week, which often happens with exempt level employees, they typically are not eligible for overtime. And the reason I say typically is because there are some companies out there that are generous and will give their exempt employees extra money for working overtime, but that's rare. That's not always the case. So,
and some assistants get bonus. Sometimes there are other ways to acknowledge all of that overtime. Jen, we have a few more, right? Yep. It's overtime work. This is an interesting one.
Okay, so I think I saw it. It briefly came up, and it was about travel pay. There you go. All right, so how does overtime work when you need to travel for work if you're a non-exempt and hourly? Oh, travel pay questions are so complicated. We get so many of those. So it's really interesting. As a non-exempt employee, if you are traveling, a couple things to keep in mind. When you travel for work as a non-exempt employee, the employer does not have to pay for travel time. That is your normal commute to and from your work site. So that's one thing to keep in mind. They do have to pay employees when they're traveling on special one-day assignments to other cities. And if they're traveling overnight, they need to pay for the time spent traveling, even on days that they're normally off, but it cuts across their normal work time. So what that means is if I'm a non-exempt hourly employee and I work Monday through Friday typically, and I have to go travel somewhere on Saturday or Sunday, and it happens to be during my regular 9 to 5 hours, that time should be considered hours worked and paid. And that actually does play into calculating the overtime. So if you're a non-exempt employee and you're hourly paid and you are traveling for work, make sure you keep good records of the times that you are traveling, whether it's in a plane, train, automobile. If you're working in a hotel room, when you get there, any time actually worked is paid, and travel time is considered work time if the employer is requiring you to do that.
Okay. We have time for one more, Jen.
Sure.
So theoretically, person should be paid the same amount.
Okay, let's see. So let me just read this. So theoretically, a person should be paid the same amount for the same job. The only difference would be that exempt does not get overtime pay. Still, there's perception that exempt employees get paid more than unexempt. Is this perception wrong? That's a good question. And let me answer the first part of that about getting paid the same for the same job. Not necessarily. As you probably are aware, there are differences. People bring different experiences and knowledge to those positions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get paid the same as someone else doing the same job. Some people come in and they negotiate their salaries, which if you are someone who is not working currently, I always, recommend negotiate salary. There's usually wiggle room there. Don't sell yourself short. There could be opportunities to make more money if you have the experience and the knowledge for those particular jobs and the value that you bring to the organization. So do people get paid the same job, the same money? Not all the time. It really depends on what it is, what the job is, the experience requirements. Somebody could come in with a certification and somebody else maybe not have a certification, even though it's the same job. So, there may be differences. And as long as they are job related and not based on things like age, race, religion, disability, protected classes, that's okay. It's okay to have that. But everybody's got to look out for themselves. So if you are offered something and you're not satisfied with it, check the market, check the rates, see if it's something that is competitive, and negotiate if you can.
Right.
And then the second part of that was about the exempt being, and I apologize I don't know if you could bring up the thing one more time. It says the perception that exempt employees get paid more than non-exempt, not necessarily. So again, as a non-exempt person, I could be doing overtime and making more money as a non-exempt person than I make as a salaried person who works 50, 60 hours a week and gets paid the same salary. So that is not always the case. It could be that the non-exempt hourly person is actually making more than somebody who is salaried and exempt.
Yeah. But, a point I'd like to make, because this does speak to the culture, so say you are putting in 20 hours of overtime, like, what does that do to the quality of your life is the thing. So yes, you're making more money, but you're killing yourself with an 80-hour work week or 70-hour work week. Whereas assistants, Amber, are looking at people who are salaried and putting in a certain number of hours and are getting increases every year or so, and not necessarily being demanded to have to add to their hours in order to increase their salary. So that's where that perception thing comes in.
Yeah.
To that.
Yeah, I mean, that's very workplace specific. I've been in workplaces where Non-exempt and hourly employees are eligible for bonuses and rate increases, just like individuals who are salaried and exempt. Yeah, there may be differences based on how the person is paid. So if I am a salaried exempt person and I make more money than someone else who is paid hourly and non-exempt, of course, my bonuses or my merit increases may be more if it's a percentage of my salary. So there may be differences like that. That's again part of that. That compensation philosophy, the compensation policy and practices of the organization, and trying to understand, why employees are paid the way that they're paid. And hopefully your HR or your manager will be able to have that information to provide to you and be transparent about it.
Absolutely. And that is a perfect place for us to end. And I want to invite everyone on the call to follow up with these resources. This was so useful. Amber Clayton, thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to be back next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Heads Together. We see this platform as a place to tackle the workplace's trickiest issues, especially as they relate to executive assistants. So Jen Wilner, I want to thank you from behind the scenes, and just wish everyone a great rest of the day, and to please share the replay with those people who need to know. One of the main messages that I took away from Amber's conversation was to arm yourself with data, and then to have the conversation with your leaders and with HR about the compensation philosophy at your company. And with the pandemic, if changes need to be made, now's the time that they're looking at making them. So I wish you all the best. You know how to find me, Bonnie at BonnieLow-Kramen.com. Please go to the website, betheultimateassistant.com. Join SHRM. We've got some wonderful experts like Amber Clayton, who has so generously offered to be a resource. So thank you so much, Amber. And thanks everyone for being here.
Bye.